We imagine the burning of the Great Library of Alexandria as the ultimate tragedy of the ancient world, a bonfire of irreplaceable knowledge. But what if the greater, more profound story is not about the destruction of the scrolls, but about the unique and fragile material they were written on? Imagine a world where the very act of writing a law, of recording a history, of sending a military dispatch, of composing a poem was utterly dependent on the goodwill of a foreign power. For 3,000 years, this was the reality for the entire Mediterranean world. It was a reality dictated not by armies or kings, but by the biology of a single humble river reed that would only grow in the marshes of a single river delta. This is the story of Papyrus, the world's first paper, and the story of Egypt's silent 3,000-year stranglehold on the very software of civilization. To understand the power of papyrus, we must first imagine a world without it, a world of immense information friction. In Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, knowledge was recorded on heavy, brittle, and cumbersome clay tablets. A single book could be a library of dozens of these weighty bricks, impossible to transport and slow to inscribe. In Greece and Rome, everyday notes were scratched onto reusable wax tablets, a medium that was ephemeral by design, while important decrees were carved in stone or inscribed on lead, materials of permanence but not of portability. The alternative, animal skin parchment, was durable and beautiful, but it was astronomically expensive, requiring the slaughter of an entire flock of sheep to produce a single significant volume. The ancient world was drowning in information, but it lacked an efficient, affordable, and portable medium to manage it. The solution to this global crisis of information technology grew, as it had for millennia, in the lush, waterlogged marshes of the Nile Delta. It was a Cyperus papyrus plant. The Egyptians, with their unique geographical gift, had perfected a manufacturing process that transformed the pith of this simple reed into a revolutionary new material. A smooth, lightweight, flexible, and astonishingly durable writing surface. It could be rolled into scrolls for easy transport and storage, and it could be mass-produced on an industrial scale, making it relatively affordable. Papyrus was not just a new kind of paper. It was a disruptive technology on par with the printing press or the microchip. It was the physical hardware that would run the operating system of the ancient world. This investigation will frame papyrus not as a passive backdrop to history, but as a strategic commodity whose production was a carefully controlled monopoly. We will argue that Egypt's exclusive control over this essential material gave it a unique and powerful form of leverage over the entire Mediterranean for 3 millennia. Our journey will begin in the Nile marshes to uncover the botanical secret of papyrus. We will enter the workshops of the ancient papermakers to reveal the complex technology of its creation. We will then chart the course of its ancient trade, showing how this Egyptian export became the indispensable fuel for the intellectual explosion of classical Athens and the vast continent-spanning Roman Empire. We will see how this monopoly could be weaponized, as the Ptolemaic kings allegedly cut off the supply to a rival library, an act of information warfare. Finally, we will explore why this 3,000-year-old monopoly finally came to an end, and how its disappearance plunged Europe into a new kind of dark age. This is the story of the world's first information monopoly, a tale of how the power to control the page was in many ways the power to control the world. The story of Egypt's most enduring monopoly begins not in a palace or a workshop, but in the primeval, watery wilderness of the Nile Delta. For thousands of years before the canals in the cities, this was a vast, sprawling, and fecund landscape, a labyrinth of shifting channels, lagoons, and marshes, teeming with life. And the undisputed king of this ecosystem was a single remarkable plant, Cyperus papyrus. While related sedge plants grew in other parts of the world, it was only here, in the unique, nutrient-rich and sun-drenched environment of the delta, that the papyrus plant grew to the colossal size and in the immense forest-like density required for industrial-scale production. The Egyptian stranglehold on information was not, at its origin, a human invention. It was a gift of botany and geography, a natural monopoly bestowed by the river god Hapi himself. The cypress papyrus plant is a marvel of botanical design. It is a tall, graceful, but incredibly robust aquatic sedge. Its root system is a thick, tangled rhizome that anchors it firmly in the muddy, oxygen-poor soil of the marsh. From this base, it sends up a tall, triangular stalk or culm that can grow to a height of 15 feet or more, as thick as a man's arm at its base. This stalk is the key to the entire technology. It is tough, fibrous, and filled with a spongy white pith. At its top, the stalk erupts in a beautiful, sunburst-like umbel of fine, feathery filaments, the flower of the plant. To the ancient Egyptians, these great thickets of the papyrus, swaying in the breeze, were not just a plant, they were a symbol of the very life and fertility of Lower Egypt. The papyrus culm was one of the most common and sacred motifs in their architecture, a constant reminder of the natural world that sustained them. For millennia, the Egyptians used this ubiquitous plant for 1,000 different purposes. The thick root rhizomes could be dried and used as a fuel source. The tough outer rind of the stalk was woven into ropes, sails for their boats, baskets, boxes, and even simple furniture. The feathery umbels were used to make garlands for the gods. The smaller, more tender shoots were even eaten as a food source. The papyrus marsh was the great, renewable resource that underpinned the material culture of the early Egyptian civilization. But it was the discovery of how to process the inner pith of the stalk that would transform this useful plant into a strategic asset of immense global importance. What was it about the Nile Delta that made it the world's sole papyrus factory? The answer lies in a perfect and unrepeatable combination of environmental factors. The plant thrives in shallow, slow-moving fresh water, a condition perfectly met by the sprawling, labyrinthine channels of the delta as the Nile fanned out to meet the Mediterranean. It requires a constant, year-round supply of water, which the ever-present Nile provided. And it needs an immense amount of sunlight and a long, warm growing season, a gift of Egypt's famously predictable and beneficent climate. The annual inundation of the Nile, the great flood that renewed the agricultural lands, also flushed the Nile marshes with a fresh supply of the rich, nutrient-laden silt that the papyrus plant craved. This unique confluence of geography and climate created forests of papyrus in the delta, dense, impenetrable thickets that stretched for hundreds of square miles. The sheer biomass was staggering. This was the key. While smaller, thinner varieties of cypress might have grown in the marshes of Mesopotamia or the Levant, they never achieved the size, the thickness, or most critically, the immense, inexhaustible quantity of the Egyptian variant. Only in Egypt could papyrus be harvested not as a rare, special plant, but as a bulk commodity, a crop that could be reaped on an industrial scale, year after year, century after century. This natural monopoly was the foundation of a 3,000-year-long economic advantage. The pharaohs and later the Ptolemaic kings and Roman governors who ruled Egypt understood the immense value of this unique asset. The great papyrus marshes of the delta were considered state property. The harvesting of the plant was a carefully controlled and often taxed industry. This was not a resource that was left to chance. It was the exclusive, natural-born treasure of the Egyptian state. Any other power in the ancient world that wished to use this revolutionary writing material, from a Greek philosopher to a Roman tax collector, could not grow it themselves. They had to buy it, and there was only one seller. The entire edifice of the ancient world's information economy was built on the foundation of this single, humble, and geographically exclusive river reed. The Nile Delta had provided the raw material, but to transform the tough, fibrous stalk of a waterlogged reed into a smooth, durable, and lightweight writing surface was an act of pure human ingenuity. The process of making papyrus was a masterpiece of ancient technology, a multi-stage industrial operation that required specialized tools, immense skill, and a deep, almost alchemical understanding of the plant's properties. This was not a simple craft, but a true manufacturing process, perfected and standardized in the workshops, or paper factories of ancient Egypt. The secret of the papyrus monopoly was not just in having the plant, but in knowing, with the precision of a master craftsman, how to unlock the paper within it. The process began with the harvest. Teams of workers would have waded into the dense, shallow marshes of the delta in flat-bottom skiffs. They would select the finest, mature stalks, those that were thickest and tallest, and cut them at their base with sharp, curved knives. These heavy, waterlogged stalks were then bundled together and transported from the marshes to the workshops, which were likely located on higher, drier ground nearby. The speed of this process was crucial. The stalks had to be worked while they were still fresh and saturated with sap. A dried-out stalk was brittle and useless. In the workshop, the first stage of preparation began. The beautiful, feathery umbels were cut off. Then the long triangular stalk was cut into manageable sections, typically around 12 to 18 inches, the desired height of the final scroll. The most delicate and skillful part of this initial stage was the peeling of the stalk. Using a sharp knife, a worker had to carefully remove the green outer rind, which was tough and useless for paper, to reveal the precious white and fibrous pith within. This was like peeling a giant triangular vegetable, and it required a steady hand to avoid damaging the valuable core. Now came the heart of the entire process, the transformation of the pith into a sheet of paper. The triangular pith was not mashed into a pulp as in modern papermaking. Instead, the Egyptian artisans used a technique of lamination. With a long, fine bronze needle or a sharp knife, the worker would skillfully slice or unpeel the pith into a series of long, incredibly thin and translucent strips. The quality of the final paper was determined by the skill of this cut. The whitest and thinnest strips, taken from the very center of the pith, would be used to make the highest grade, most expensive paper. Once a sufficient number of these strips were cut, they were laid out on a wetted board. The first layer was arranged vertically, with each strip slightly overlapping the next. The natural sticky sap of the plant itself was often enough to act as a glue. A second layer of strips was then laid down on top of the first, but this time horizontally at 90-degree angles. This created a cross-laminated structure, a natural organic plywood. The resulting two-ply sheet was incredibly strong and resilient, resistant to tearing and able to withstand the constant rolling and unrolling of a scroll. The newly formed sheet was then subjected to immense pressure. It was placed between two layers of cloth and likely put under a heavy press, perhaps a large screw or lever press, a technology the Egyptians had mastered for making wine and oil. The pressure served two purposes. It squeezed out the excess water, and it perfectly fused the two layers of papyrus strips together, the plant's own sap creating a permanent biological bond. After being pressed, the damp sheets were removed and left to dry in the hot Egyptian sun, often on lines like laundry. The final stage was finishing. The now dry, rough sheet of papyrus was not yet ready for the scribe. Its surface had to be polished to a smooth, almost glossy finish to prevent the reed pen from snagging. This was done by rubbing the surface with a smooth, rounded object, like a polished stone, a piece of ivory, or a large seashell. Any imperfections or rough spots were smoothed away. Finally, these individual finished sheets were not sold alone. They were glued together, edge to edge, to form a long roll, or rotulus. A standard roll for the ancient trade would consist of 20 sheets, creating a scroll that could be up to 30 feet long, the standard book of the ancient world. The entire process, from the harvesting of the reed to the final polished scroll, was a complex, multi-stage, and highly organized industrial operation. It was a technology that, for 3,000 years, was the absolute foundation of the information economy of the Mediterranean world. Before the first roll of papyrus was ever sold to a Phoenician merchant, before it became the paper of the classical world, it was the indispensable software that ran the oldest and most durable civilization in human history, Egypt. The rise of the pharaonic state, with its god-kings, its monumental architecture, and its complex centralized bureaucracy, would have been simply impossible without this revolutionary writing material. Clay tablets were too cumbersome, stone was too permanent, and parchment was a distant dream. Papyrus, lightweight, portable, and mass-producible, was the perfect tool for a new kind of state, an empire built not just on divine authority, but on the power of the written record. The Egyptian monopoly on papyrus began as a monopoly on its own internal administration. The key to understanding the power of papyrus is to understand the power of the scribe. In ancient Egypt, the scribe was not a mere clerk. He was a member of a powerful and elite class, the engine of the entire state apparatus. A famous Egyptian text, the Satire of the Trades, praises the life of the scribe above all other professions, mocking the back-breaking labor of the farmer and the dangers of the soldier's life. Be a scribe, it advises. It saves you from toil and protects you from all manner of work. This prestige was a direct result of the tool they wielded. The combination of the papyrus scroll and the reed pen, which allowed for the use of a fast and fluid hieratic, or later demotic script, was an information technology of unparalleled speed and efficiency. It allowed for the creation of a class of professional administrators who could manage the economy of a vast and complex kingdom. The most important function of this new technology was in the service of the state's most critical activity, taxation. The wealth of Egypt was the agricultural surplus of the Nile, and the state's power depended on its ability to effectively tax that surplus. Every year, armies of scribes would travel the length of the Nile Valley, their arms filled with fresh rolls of papyrus. They would meticulously survey the fields, measure their size, estimate the potential yield of the harvest, and calculate the state's share. Every bushel of grain that was collected, every head of cattle that was counted, every jar of wine that was produced was recorded on a papyrus scroll. These tax records, sent back to the central archives in the capital, were the lifeblood of the state, the data that allowed the pharaoh to fund his court, to pay his soldiers, and to provision the thousands of workers who built the great temples and pyramids. This brings us to the second great function of papyrus, project management. The construction of a monument like the Great Pyramid of Giza was one of the largest engineering projects in the ancient world, a logistical feat that required the coordination of tens of thousands of workers, the quarrying and transport of millions of tons of stone, and the precise execution of a complex architectural plan. Such a project would have been impossible without a portable and efficient medium for communication and record-keeping. The recent discovery of the Diary of Merer, a papyrus logbook from the reign of King Khufu, gives us a breathtaking real-time glimpse into this process. It is the daily journal of a low-level official, meticulously recording the work of his team as they transport massive limestone blocks from the quarry at Tura to the Giza Plateau. He notes the dates, the quantities of stone, and the rations of bread and beer for his men. It is a stunning, mundane, and profoundly important document, the world's oldest surviving piece of paper, and it is the ultimate proof of how papyrus was used to manage the state's most ambitious undertakings. The reach of the papyrus-fueled bureaucracy extended into every corner of Egyptian life. It was the medium for law. The great legal codes of the pharaohs were recorded on scrolls, and individual court proceedings, from land disputes to criminal trials, were all meticulously documented. It was the medium for trade and commerce. A merchant could carry a rolled-up contract in his hand, a lightweight and legally binding document, a feat impossible for his Mesopotamian counterpart who had to rely on heavy, bulky clay tablets. And, most famously, it was the medium for religion. The sacred hymns, the temple rituals, and the complex funerary texts of the Book of the Dead were all written on papyrus, creating a standardized religious canon that helped to unify the culture of the two lands. The Egyptian state, therefore, was a true paper empire. Its power was inextricably linked to its mastery of this information technology. The vast archives of the pharaohs were the state's memory, a repository of knowledge that gave it a continuity and stability that was the envy of the ancient world. The ability to mass-produce this material from the abundant reeds of their own river delta gave the Egyptians a profound and enduring administrative advantage over all their rivals. Before they ever sold a single scroll abroad, they had perfected its use at home, building the most sophisticated and long-lasting bureaucracy the world had ever seen, on a foundation of paper. For centuries, the power of papyrus was a purely domestic affair, the exclusive administrative tool of the Egyptian state. But the advantages of this revolutionary material were too great to remain contained within the Nile Valley forever. As the trade networks of the Late Bronze and Early Iron Age grew in complexity, the kingdoms and city-states of the Near East and the Aegean found themselves confronting the same crisis of information friction that Egypt had solved a millennium before. They needed a more efficient medium for their own burgeoning bureaucracies and commercial enterprises. This created a powerful external demand, and the Egyptians, recognizing the immense economic potential of their unique national resource, began to export it. This was the beginning of the international papyrus trade, a commercial boom that would make one Phoenician city legendary and would transform Egyptian papyrus from a domestic utility into a strategic global commodity. The primary gateway for this new export economy was the ancient and venerable port city of Gubla, known to the Greeks as Byblos, on the coast of modern-day Lebanon. Byblos had, since the dawn of history, been one of Egypt's most important and enduring trading partners. It was the main source for the one critical resource that the Nile Valley lacked: high-quality timber. The great cedar, pine, and fir trees of the Lebanese mountains were the essential raw material for the shipbuilding, temple construction, and funerary industries of the wood-poor pharaohs. For millennia, a steady stream of Egyptian ships had made the journey to Byblos, their holds filled with Egyptian grain, gold, and manufactured goods to trade for Lebanese wood. It was this ancient, established, and mutually beneficial trade relationship that made Byblos the natural conduit for the new papyrus trade. As the demand for a writing material grew in the Levant and beyond, the Egyptian state began to include massive quantities of papyrus rolls in the cargoes they sent to Byblos. The Phoenician merchants of Byblos, the great middlemen of the Mediterranean, then became the primary distributors of this new and valuable commodity. They would purchase the papyrus in bulk from the Egyptians and then resell it at a significant profit to the other city-states of the Levant, to the rising kingdoms of Israel and Judah, and, most critically, to the emerging city-states of the Greek world. The connection between Byblos and the papyrus trade became so absolute, so famous, that the city's name became forever synonymous with the product itself. The Greeks called the papyrus scrolls Byblos, after the port from which they were acquired. From this, they derived the word biblion, meaning book, and from that we get our modern words like bibliography, and most famously, the Bible, which simply means the books. The very language we use to describe our most sacred and important texts is a direct echo, a linguistic fossil of this ancient Phoenician city's monopoly on the distribution of Egyptian paper. For the kingdoms of the Levant, the availability of this new material was a game changer. It allowed their own scribal classes to flourish, to develop their own alphabetic scripts, and to manage their own growing state and temple economies with a new level of efficiency. But the most significant new market, and the one that would fuel the trade for centuries to come, was Greece. The emerging Greek city-states of the Archaic period were undergoing a period of explosive commercial and intellectual growth. They were founding colonies, expanding their trade networks, and, most importantly, they had adopted and adapted the Phoenician alphabet, creating a simple, efficient, and widely accessible writing system. But a writing system is useless without something to write on. Papyrus was the perfect partner for the new Greek alphabet. It was cheap enough to be used for everyday commercial transactions, for recording contracts, for logging inventory, for writing letters between merchants. This was a crucial factor in the rapid expansion of the Greek economy. The ability to manage information and conduct business through writing on a lightweight and portable medium was a massive competitive advantage. At the same time, papyrus was the medium that fueled the first great intellectual flowering of the West. The epic poems of Homer, the first works of Greek philosophy, the lyrics of Sappho, all of these were recorded, circulated, and preserved for posterity on scrolls of imported Egyptian papyrus. The papyrus roll, acquired through the merchants of Byblos, was the physical hardware that powered the very birth of the Western literary and intellectual tradition. The great trade in ideas was beginning, and it was a trade that was utterly dependent on the physical trade in paper. If the papyrus trade found its first great export market in the commercial centers of the archaic Greek world, it reached its absolute zenith of influence in the city of 5th century BC Athens. The Golden Age of Athens was one of the most literate, intellectually vibrant, and administratively complex societies the world had ever seen. The explosion of genius in this single city, the birth of democracy, philosophy, tragedy, comedy, and history as we know it, was a cultural firestorm that illuminated the ancient world. But this fire needed fuel, and the fuel that fed the Athenian mind, the very medium that made this intellectual and political revolution possible, was the humble papyrus scroll, imported at great expense from the distant banks of the Nile. The Athenian connection reveals, in stunning detail, just how dependent the great powers of the age were on Egypt's monopoly of information technology. The entire machinery of the radical Athenian democracy was run on paper. This was not a system of kings and edicts, but one of laws, of records, of public debate, and of immense, almost overwhelming documentation. Every law passed by the assembly, every decree of the council, every verdict reached in the great popular law courts had to be written down. Public notices were posted on papyrus in the agora. The financial accounts of the state, including the detailed expense reports for great public works like the Parthenon, were meticulously kept on papyrus scrolls by a class of trained public clerks. This was a government of the people, but it was also a government of the written word. Without a cheap, abundant, and easily transportable writing material, this level of administrative transparency and complexity would have been simply unthinkable. Clay tablets were too slow and cumbersome. Wax tablets were too ephemeral. Only the papyrus scroll provided the efficiency and capacity that this new form of government demanded. Beyond the mechanics of the state, papyrus was the essential hardware for the city's intellectual explosion. For the first time in history, a widespread, secular, and relatively affordable book trade became possible. While scrolls were still expensive for an individual, they were accessible enough to create a new and vibrant reading culture among the educated classes. This was the age of the first great libraries, both private and public. Philosophers like Plato and Aristotle built their schools and their arguments upon a foundation of written texts. Their dialogues and treatises were not just spoken, they were written, copied, circulated, and debated on papyrus scrolls. The very possibility of creating a complex, cumulative body of philosophical and scientific knowledge depends on the ability to record and transmit ideas with accuracy and permanence. The intellectual life of Athens was not just a conversation of minds, it was a conversation of texts, and those texts were made of papyrus. The same was true for the birth of drama and history. The great playwrights Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides wrote their masterpieces down. The actors worked from scripts, and the plays themselves were preserved and circulated as written texts, allowing them to be studied and reperformed across the Greek world. The historian Herodotus, the father of history, traveled the known world gathering stories and information, but he compiled his great histories on a series of papyrus rolls. His successor, Thucydides, wrote his powerful analytical account of the Peloponnesian War, the world's first great work of political science, on papyrus. The birth of Western literature was not just an act of creative genius, it was an act that was inseparable from the physical technology of the scroll. This complete and utter dependency on a foreign import was a known and accepted fact of life, a strategic reality of the Athenian economy. Athens was the great manufacturing and naval power of the Aegean, but it was a resource-poor state. As we have seen, they were critically dependent on the import of grain from the Black Sea for their food and timber from the north for their ships. To this list of strategic dependencies, we must add papyrus. It was the one essential raw material for their administration and their culture that they could not produce themselves. Their entire intellectual and political superstructure was built on a foundation of imported Egyptian reeds. This dependency is visible in the physical record. The Athenian statesman Pericles, in his famous funeral oration, boasts that the products of the whole world flow in upon us. And nowhere was this more true than in the bustling port of Piraeus. Alongside the grain ships from the north and the luxury goods from across the Aegean, there would have been a constant, steady stream of merchant vessels arriving from the Egyptian port of Naucratis, their holds filled with the precious cargo of papyrus rolls. The trade was immensely profitable for the merchants who managed it, and it was a vital artery for the Athenian state. Any disruption to this supply chain would not just be an economic inconvenience, it would be a direct threat to the functioning of their democracy and the very preservation of their culture. The mind of Athens, in a very real sense, thought and wrote on paper that belonged to a foreign king. After the conquest of Alexander the Great, Egypt was transformed. It was now ruled by a dynasty of Greek kings, the Ptolemies, with their magnificent new capital at Alexandria. The Ptolemies inherited not just the throne of the Pharaohs, but also the ancient and immensely profitable monopoly on papyrus. As savvy Greek administrators and businessmen, they understood the immense power of this unique asset better than anyone. They would not just profit from the papyrus trade, they would weaponize it. The story of the great rivalry between the libraries of Alexandria and Pergamum is the most famous and explicit example of this monopoly being used as a tool of geopolitical hardball, an act of economic warfare that would inadvertently lead to the creation of the very technology that would one day supplant papyrus itself. The Ptolemies' grand project, the jewel in the crown of their kingdom, was the Great Library of Alexandria. This was more than just a collection of books. It was a state-sponsored institution of universal knowledge, the world's first true think tank. The Ptolemies aimed to collect a copy of every single book in the known world. Their agents scoured the Mediterranean, buying or copying any scroll they could find. Ships that docked in Alexandria's harbor were required to be searched, and any books found on board were confiscated, copied by the library's scribes, and the copies were then returned to the owners. It was an aggressive, state-driven policy of intellectual acquisition on a breathtaking scale. The library became the undisputed center of the Hellenistic intellectual world, attracting the greatest scholars, scientists, and poets of the age. The foundation of this entire enterprise, the jewel in the crown of their kingdom, was papyrus. The Ptolemies had a limitless, state-controlled supply of the world's best writing material, an immense home field advantage. They could produce new scrolls for their library and for the sprawling bureaucracy of their kingdom at a cost no other state could match. And they could use their control over the export market to generate a massive stream of revenue for the state treasury. The papyrus economy was now more centralized and more explicitly a tool of state power than ever before. But Alexandria's cultural supremacy was not to go unchallenged. In the 2nd century BC, a rival power in the Hellenistic world, the Attalid kingdom with its capital at Pergamum in modern-day Turkey, began to build a library of its own. Under the ambitious king Eumenes II, the library at Pergamum grew rapidly, its agents competing directly with the Ptolemies in the international book market, driving up the price of rare texts. Eumenes even managed to lure the great scholar Aristophanes of Byzantium away from Alexandria to head his new institution. For the Ptolemies, who viewed cultural supremacy as a key element of their geopolitical power, this was an intolerable act of rivalry. According to the Roman historian Pliny the Elder, the Ptolemaic king, likely Ptolemy V, decided to engage in an act of direct economic and intellectual warfare. To cripple his rival's project, he declared an embargo. He cut off the supply of the one essential material that he knew his rival needed to build a great library. He banned the export of all Egyptian papyrus to the kingdom of Pergamum. It was a brilliant and brutal strategic move, a clear demonstration of the power that the papyrus monopoly conferred. He was attempting to literally stop his rival from being able to produce new books. This act of industrial sabotage, however, had a spectacular and unforeseen consequence. Faced with a sudden and catastrophic paper famine, the scholars and craftsmen of Pergamum were forced to innovate. They turned to the only other viable writing material available, treated animal skin. While animal skins had been used for writing for centuries, the process was expensive and the quality was often poor. The crisis spurred by the Ptolemaic embargo led to a period of intense innovation at Pergamum. They perfected the techniques for preparing the skins, washing, liming, stretching them on frames, and scraping them with curved knives to create a new, radically improved writing surface. It was thin, strong, incredibly durable, and unlike the rougher side of a papyrus sheet, it was smooth enough to be written on both sides. This new high-tech material was named Pergamenum in honor of the city where it was perfected. We know it as parchment. The invention of parchment was a direct response to the weaponization of the papyrus trade. It was a classic story of innovation born from necessity. Parchment was, in many ways, a superior technology. Its durability was far greater than the relatively fragile papyrus. A parchment codex or book could withstand centuries of use, while a papyrus scroll was susceptible to moisture and decay. However, its one great disadvantage was its immense cost. To produce a single large parchment manuscript could require the skins of an entire flock of sheep or goats. For the great libraries of the age and for the day-to-day administration of a large economy, it was simply too expensive to be a viable replacement for papyrus. Thus, the Ptolemaic embargo failed in its immediate goal of destroying the library at Pergamum, but it succeeded in a larger sense. It did not break the papyrus monopoly. For the next several centuries, papyrus would remain the dominant, everyday writing material of the ancient world due to its immense cost advantage. But the seed of its replacement had been planted. The craftsmen of Pergamum had created a rival technology, a high-end, durable alternative that would bide its time. The day would come, centuries later, when the chaos of a collapsing world would make the long-distance papyrus supply chain untenable, and the world would turn, out of necessity, to the more expensive but more durable and locally producible technology of parchment. The Ptolemies, in their act of economic hubris, had inadvertently sponsored the invention of their monopoly's own executioner. When Rome conquered Egypt in 30 BC, it acquired more than just a granary. It seized direct control of the world's paper supply. For the next 4 centuries, the Roman Empire would become the single largest consumer of papyrus in human history. The sheer scale and complexity of the Roman state, a political and economic entity that stretched from the misty hills of Britain to the deserts of Mesopotamia, was made possible by a river of paper that flowed year after year from the workshops of the Nile Delta. The Roman Empire was, in the most literal sense, an empire run on papyrus. It was the essential software for imperial administration, the medium for its laws, the carrier of its culture, and the backbone of its vast economy. This absolute dependency on a single province for its most vital administrative tool was one of the most remarkable features of the entire Roman system. The demand was driven, first and foremost, by the needs of the immense Roman bureaucracy. Unlike the more compact city-states of the past, the Roman Empire was a massive, complex, and data-intensive organization. To govern 100 million people, to manage a standing army of 500,000 soldiers, and to tax the economy of 3 continents required a relentless, obsessive, and all-encompassing system of record-keeping. And the medium for all of it was papyrus. Every tax receipt, every census record, every legal deed of sale, every petition to the governor, and every imperial decree was written on a sheet or a roll of this Egyptian material. The archives of a single Roman administrative office in a provincial capital would have contained thousands, even tens of thousands of these scrolls. Nowhere was this dependency more critical than in the administration of the military. A Roman legion was not just a fighting force, it was a massive, mobile bureaucracy. The paperwork was staggering. There were the daily duty rosters, the pay records for every single soldier, the supply inventories for grain and equipment, the medical reports from the camp hospital, and the constant, vital stream of official correspondence, orders, intelligence reports, and dispatches that connected the legion on the frontier to the high command in Rome. All of this was written on papyrus. The ability of a general on the Rhine to communicate his plans to a subordinate 100 miles away, or for the emperor in Rome to issue a command to his governor in Syria, depended on this lightweight, portable, and reliable information technology. Without a steady supply of papyrus, the command and control structure of the world's greatest military machine would have simply collapsed. The legal system was another voracious consumer. Rome was an empire of laws, and its complex legal framework, the foundation of Western jurisprudence, was built on a mountain of paper. Every contract, every will, every lawsuit, and every judicial ruling generated a papyrus trail. The work of the great Roman jurists, the compilation of the immense body of Roman law that would culminate in the Justinian Code, was a scholarly and administrative enterprise that consumed a forest of papyrus. The certainty and predictability of Roman law, one of the key factors in its long-term stability and economic success, was guaranteed by the written papyrus record. And then there was the demand from the private sector economy. The world of Roman commerce, with its complex banking systems, its shipping contracts, and its vast network of trade, ran on papyrus. A merchant in Ostia could receive a letter of credit written on papyrus from a business partner in Alexandria, a level of financial sophistication made possible by a reliable information medium. The thousands of preserved papyri from the rubbish heaps of Egyptian towns like Oxyrhynchus give us a stunning, intimate glimpse into this world. We see private letters, business accounts, tax receipts, and shopping lists, the mundane, everyday paperwork of an entire society, all of it written on the product of the local reeds. But this complete and utter dependency on a single source came with a strategic vulnerability. The entire information economy of the Roman Empire was dependent on the stability and security of one province, Egypt. The Roman state was acutely aware of this. After the conquest, Augustus had made Egypt a special imperial province, governed not by a senator but by a prefect of his own choosing, a man whose loyalty was directly to the emperor. No senator was even allowed to set foot in Egypt without the emperor's permission. While this was primarily to control the grain supply, it also had the effect of placing the world's paper supply under direct imperial control. The governor of Egypt was not just the empire's baker, he was its stationer-in-chief. For centuries, under the stability of the Pax Romana, this system worked brilliantly. The sea lanes were safe, the production in Egypt was efficient and uninterrupted, and the river of paper flowed reliably to every corner of the empire. But it was a system built on the assumption of that very stability. The architects of the Roman paper empire had created a system of incredible efficiency, but they had also created a single point of failure. The day that the sea lanes were no longer safe, or the day that Egypt itself was lost, the entire administrative and intellectual life of the empire would be thrown into a catastrophic crisis. The empire's memory was written on a material whose supply it could not guarantee forever. The papyrus trade was more than just a supply chain. It was a highly sophisticated and immensely profitable business, a cornerstone of the Egyptian economy for millennia. It was a market characterized by a single-source monopoly, a tiered product line of varying qualities, and a complex relationship between state control and private enterprise. While the pharaohs, and later the Roman emperors, held the ultimate authority over the papyrus varchas, the day-to-day business of production and distribution was a dynamic and competitive industry, a classic example of how the ancient world organized a large-scale commercial enterprise. To understand the economics of this monopoly is to understand the immense value that could be generated by controlling the world's most essential information technology. The entire business model was built on a pyramid of quality. Just as the garum industry had its fine floss gari and its cheap alec, the papyrus producers created a range of different grades to cater to different segments of the market. At the very top of the pyramid was the finest and most expensive grade, known in the Roman era as Charta Augusta and later as Charta Claudia. This was the imperial-grade paper, made from the whitest, thinnest and purest strips taken from the very center of the papyrus pith. The resulting sheets were large, incredibly thin, flexible, and almost perfectly white. This was the paper reserved for the most important of documents, sacred texts for the temples, the great works of literature destined for the imperial libraries, and the official decrees of the emperor himself. Its price was astronomical, a luxury good for the pinnacle of the state and literary world. Just below this was the high-quality paper used for most official administrations. The papyrus trade was more than just a supply chain. It was a highly sophisticated and immensely profitable business, a cornerstone of the Egyptian economy for millennia. It was a market characterized by a single-source monopoly, a tiered product line of varying qualities, and a complex relationship between state control and private enterprise. While the pharaohs, and later the Roman emperors, held the ultimate authority over the papyrus warshas, the day-to-day business of production and distribution was a dynamic and competitive industry, a classic example of how the ancient world organized a large-scale commercial enterprise. To understand the economics of this monopoly is to understand the immense value that could be generated by controlling the world's most essential information technology. The entire business model was built on a pyramid of quality. Just as the garum industry had its fine floss gari and its cheap alec, the papyrus producers created a range of different grades to cater to different segments of the market. At the very top of the pyramid was the finest and most expensive grade, known in the Roman era as Charta Augusta and later as Charta Claudia. This was the imperial-grade paper, made from the widest, thinnest, and purest strips taken from the very center of the papyrus pith. The resulting sheets were large, incredibly thin, flexible, and almost perfectly white. This was the paper reserved for the most important of documents, sacred texts for the temples, the great works of literature destined for the imperial libraries, and the official decrees of the emperor himself. Its price was astronomical, a luxury good for the pinnacle of the state and literary world. Just below this was the high-quality paper used for most official administrative and literary purposes. This grade, known as hieratic paper in earlier times, was still white, strong, and smooth, but was made from slightly narrower strips. This was the workhorse of the scribal class, the material used for legal contracts, tax records, and the copying of important books. The quality was still excellent, and it represented the bulk of the high-end export market. Further down the scale were the cheaper, more commercial grades. These were made from the narrower strips of pith taken from closer to the outer rind of the plant. The resulting sheets were often smaller, thicker, and more brownish in color, with a rougher texture. This was the everyday paper of the Roman world, the material used for private letters, for merchants' accounts, for school exercises, and for all the mundane, ephemeral paperwork of daily life. At the very bottom of the market was the cheapest grade of all, Charta Emporetica, or market paper. This was a coarse, brown, almost cardboard-like material, not used for writing but for wrapping and packaging other goods. In this incredibly efficient, tiered market, every single part of the papyrus plant was monetized and sold. This system of quality grading allowed the producers to maximize their profits from every single stalk of papyrus. But who were these producers? The papyrus marshes themselves were almost certainly state-owned, a royal or imperial monopoly. The government would have licensed out the rights to harvest the reeds, a major source of state revenue. The production of the paper itself, however, seems to have been a private enterprise. The owners of the papyrus factories, the papyropole, were entrepreneurs. They would purchase the raw reeds from the state, hire the skilled labor needed to manufacture the sheets, and then sell the finished product. This was a classic public-private partnership, where the state controlled the raw resource and the private sector managed the industrial production. The distribution and sale of the papyrus was another layer of private enterprise. Large-scale merchants would have purchased the rolls in bulk from the Egyptian factories. They would then ship this cargo to the great ports of the Mediterranean, like Puteoli in Italy, where it would be sold to wholesalers. These wholesalers would then sell it on to the final retailers, the owners of the small shops, or taberne, in the cities, where an individual scribe or citizen could buy a single sheet or a small roll for their personal needs. At every single step of this long distribution chain, from the marshes of the Delta to a dusty shop in Roman Britain, a profit was made. The profits, by all accounts, were immense. The papyrus trade was one of the most important and lucrative sectors of the entire Egyptian economy, a primary source of the wealth that made the province so vital to the Roman Empire. The state grew rich from licensing the marshes and from levying heavy export taxes on the finished product. The factory owners, the shippers, the wholesalers, and the retailers all built their fortunes on the back of this ubiquitous and indispensable commodity. It was a vast, complex, and highly profitable ecosystem, a testament to the Roman genius for commerce. But it was an ecosystem that was, like the papyrus plant itself, entirely dependent on the unique and irreplaceable conditions of a single river valley. For 3 millennia, the papyrus scroll had been the undisputed king of information technology, a symbol of permanence and the bedrock of the Mediterranean economy. The Egyptian monopoly on its production had outlasted the Pharaohs, the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. But no monopoly, no matter how deeply entrenched, is forever. The long, slow death of the papyrus age was not a single event, but a convergence of powerful historical forces. The political and economic collapse of its greatest consumer, the severing of the ancient trade routes by a new geopolitical power, and the final, decisive victory of a more durable, if more expensive, rival technology would conspire to bring the age of the river reed to a close. The first great shock to the system was the same crisis that had crippled the garum and tin trades, the slow-motion collapse of the Western Roman Empire. The political chaos, the endemic warfare, and the economic fragmentation of the 4th and 5th centuries AD shattered the vast, unified consumer market that had been the papyrus industry's primary client. The great centralized Roman bureaucracy, with its insatiable appetite for paperwork, disintegrated. The sophisticated legal and commercial systems that depended on written contracts and records fell into disuse, and the widespread secular literary culture of the classical world withered away. In the new, impoverished, and largely illiterate successor kingdoms of the West, the demand for this once essential commodity plummeted. There was no longer a vast, interconnected administrative or intellectual economy to support a massive, long-distance trade in paper. The physical trade routes themselves became unreliable and dangerous. The Vandal conquest of North Africa and the rise of their powerful fleet made the sea lanes of the Western Mediterranean a perilous space. The old, secure, Roman-policed shipping network was a distant memory. While some papyrus still trickled into the West, particularly to the papal chanceries in Rome and the centers of surviving learning in Italy and Spain, it became an increasingly rare, expensive, and high-status luxury item. The days of papyrus as an everyday, affordable commodity were over. The second and more decisive blow was the Arab conquest of Egypt in the 7th century AD. This event fundamentally and permanently altered the geopolitical landscape. The source of the world's paper supply was now in the hands of the rising Islamic Caliphate. For the Eastern Roman, or Byzantine Empire, which was now locked in a generational life-or-death struggle with the Caliphate, this was a strategic catastrophe. Their primary supply of the essential administrative fuel for their own complex bureaucracy was now controlled by their greatest enemy. While the trade did not stop entirely, commerce has a way of crossing even the most hostile of borders. The supply to Constantinople became sporadic, expensive, and politically fraught. This geopolitical crisis forced the Byzantines and the rest of the Christian world to finally and fully embrace the alternative technology that had been waiting in the wings for 1,000 years: parchment. As we have seen, parchment, the treated skin of animals, had been perfected in Pergamum as a direct response to a Ptolemaic papyrus embargo. Now, a far greater and more permanent embargo was in place. Parchment's great disadvantage had always been its immense cost, but it had two crucial advantages that were now of paramount importance. First, its raw materials, sheep, goats, and calves, were available everywhere in Europe. It could be produced locally, freeing the kingdoms of the West from their ancient dependency on Egypt. Second, it was incredibly durable, far more so than the fragile papyrus. This durability was perfectly suited for the needs of the new medieval world. As society became more fragmented and localized, the need was for a material that could preserve knowledge safely for centuries within the walls of a monastery library. The papyrus scroll, which was vulnerable to damp and decay in the cooler, wetter climates of Europe, was ill-suited for this task. The parchment codex, the modern book form with its cut pages sewn together, was the perfect vessel for the long-term preservation of sacred texts like the Bible and the dwindling corpus of classical literature. In the new, impoverished, and largely illiterate successor kingdoms of the West, the demand for this once essential commodity plummeted. There was no longer a vast, interconnected administrative or intellectual economy to support a massive, long-distance trade in paper. The papyrus industry did not die overnight. It continued for several more centuries within the Islamic world, which now controlled its source. But even there, a final disruptive technology was on the horizon. From the east, carried along the same Silk Road that had once brought luxury goods, came the secret of true paper, a technology invented in China, made from pulped rags and plant fibers. The Arabs learned this secret from Chinese prisoners of war in the 8th century, and the new, cheaper, and more efficient technology quickly spread across their empire, establishing great paper-making centers in cities like Baghdad and Damascus. By the 11th century, even in Egypt, the production of papyrus, the plant that defined its economy for millennia, had ceased almost entirely. Its 3,000-year reign was over, made obsolete by a combination of political collapse and the arrival of a superior technology. Our investigation began with the ashes of a great library and the question of the fragile medium upon which all ancient knowledge was recorded. We sought to understand the power of papyrus, a simple river reed that became the indispensable software of civilization. Having traced its story from its exclusive origins in the Nile Delta, through the workshops of the Egyptian papermakers, and into the administrative heart of the Greek and Roman worlds, the evidence is now clear. The verdict is that papyrus was a revolutionary information technology, and Egypt's 3,000-year-long natural monopoly over its production was one of the most subtle, most enduring, and most significant sources of geopolitical and economic power in all of ancient history. We have established that the foundation of this power was a geological and botanical accident. The unique conditions of the Nile Delta gave Egypt the exclusive ability to produce papyrus on an industrial scale, creating a natural monopoly that no other civilization could break. We have deconstructed the sophisticated, multi-stage technology that transformed this raw reed into the world's first efficient, lightweight, and mass-producible paper, the essential hardware for any complex, literate society. Our investigation has demonstrated that the power of this monopoly was felt across the entire ancient world. We have shown that the intellectual explosion of classical Athens, its philosophy, its drama, its history, and the very mechanics of its democracy was written on and made possible by a reliable supply of this imported Egyptian commodity. We have seen this monopoly explicitly weaponized in the Library Wars, where a Ptolemaic embargo on papyrus exports directly spurred the innovation of its great rival, parchment, proving that the control of information technology was a recognized tool of statecraft. Most significantly, we have revealed the Roman Empire as a true paper empire, a colossal bureaucratic and military machine whose every function, from the collection of taxes to the command of its legions, was utterly dependent on the river of papyrus flowing from its Egyptian province. The control of the papyrus supply was, in a very real sense, the control of the administrative bloodline of the Western world. Finally, we have charted the long decline of this ancient monopoly. It was a death by 1,000 cuts. The fragmentation of the Roman market, the severing of trade routes by the Arab conquest of Egypt, and the final decisive shift to the more durable and locally producible parchment, a rival technology whose development had been sparked by the monopoly's own arrogance centuries before. Therefore, the final conclusion of our investigation is this. The papyrus monopoly was a quiet but potent stranglehold on the administrative, intellectual, and commercial life of the Mediterranean for 3 millennia. The story of every other great civilization of the era, Greek, Roman, and Persian, is inextricably intertwined with and was often limited by their dependency on this single Egyptian-controlled strategic resource. The power of the page was a very real and very formidable form of power. The great papyrus marshes of the Nile Delta are gone, drained and transformed by the passage of centuries. The libraries filled with their millions of scrolls have turned to dust and ash, and the technology that once ran the ancient world has been so completely superseded that it is now little more than a tourist curiosity. But the legacy of the papyrus monopoly is not in the fragile, surviving fragment of the scrolls themselves. Its true legacy is a profound and timeless lesson, one that has become more relevant in our own time than the Romans could ever have imagined. The civilization that controls the medium of information controls the world. The story of papyrus is the story of the first great information monopoly. For 3,000 years, the unique geography of Egypt gave it a stranglehold, not on a metal, not on a spice, but on the very hardware of thought, of law, of literature, and of administration. The Egyptian state, whether ruled by pharaohs, Ptolemies, or Roman governors, was the gatekeeper of knowledge. Their control was subtle, often invisible, but absolute. The story of every other great civilization in the Mediterranean is a story of a dependency on this single foreign source for their most essential tool of statecraft. This ancient reality echoes with a powerful and unsettling resonance in our own, hyper-connected 21st century. We have traded the papyrus scroll for the silicon chip, but the fundamental geopolitics of the technology remain eerily similar. The vast majority of the world's most advanced microchips, the indispensable hardware for our entire global economy, for our communications, our finances, our military, are produced in a few highly specialized and geographically concentrated locations. Our modern digital civilization, for all its seeming immateriality, is as physically dependent on the fabrication plants of Taiwan and East Asia as Rome was on the papyri workshops of the Nile Delta. The story of the Ptolemaic embargo on Pergamum is a 2,000-year-old warning about the immense strategic power that comes from controlling the production of essential information technology. The papyrus monopoly also teaches us a deeper lesson about the relationship between the idea and the object. We rightly celebrate the great intellectual achievements of the ancient world, the philosophy of Plato, the laws of Rome, the poetry of Virgil. But we often forget that these immortal ideas were, in their time, utterly dependent on a mortal, physical medium. Without a cheap, accessible, and reliable supply of papyrus, the intellectual and administrative life of the classical world would have been a fraction of what it was. It is a humbling reminder that the software of civilization, our ideas, our laws, our stories, is always dependent on the physical hardware that carries it. The history of knowledge is also the history of the trade in the materials that make knowledge possible. Thus, the ghost of the humble papyrus reed still haunts our world. Its story is a foundational chapter in the long history of the global economy and the geopolitics of information. It is a reminder that the most powerful monopolies are not always over things we can eat or build with, but over the tools we use to think, to communicate, and to govern. The laws you obey, the literature you read, the very history you have just learned. The intellectual DNA of the Western world was first written down and transmitted on a fragile, elegant, and powerful paper made from a single Egyptian river reed.